"What do you know about Japanese, kid?" Richard Caldwell's voice hissed, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, aimed squarely at Amara. It wasn't a question, but a verbal slap. It all started with a single sound, a short, clear laugh that had escaped the girl's lips. That sound, though fleeting, cut through the oppressive silence of the conference room like a piece of broken glass. A room where, just seconds before, the problem had been the interpreter beside Richard, sweat beading on his forehead as he fumbled through the translation of a nuanced statement from their Japanese partners. "Mr. Caldwell," the interpreter stammered, "he means that marketing, that sales in their market are very important." Richard winced. A shallow, inaccurate translation. He knew he was losing credibility in a multi-million-dollar deal. And then that small laugh had echoed from the hallway, where Amara was waiting for her mother, Mrs. Lewis, to finish her shift. The rage from the failing deal instantly found a perfect target. Richard spun around. "Mrs. Lewis," he snapped, not a question but an accusation. "Is this a workplace or a daycare?" Mrs. Lewis jumped, so startled she dropped her cleaning cloth. She scrambled to pull her daughter by the arm, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, sir. Truly, I'm sorry." "Amara, apologize to the man, now." But Richard ignored her. He strode directly in front of Amara and unleashed his contemptuous remark. Now he stood there, arms crossed, waiting for an apology, or perhaps for tears. But Amara didn't flinch. She lifted her chin, her clear eyes meeting the CEO's without a flicker of fear. In the thick, heavy silence, her voice rang out, clear and steady. "I can translate it more accurately than he can." Amara's words hung in the air. A stunned silence consumed the room. The interpreter's jaw dropped. Mrs. Lewis looked as if she might collapse. And then Richard Caldwell laughed. It wasn't a laugh of amusement, but a dry, mocking sound that rattled from his chest. He shook his head as if he'd just heard the world's lamest joke. "Ha! And what makes you think I should believe you?" Richard said, his voice dripping with contempt. "The confidence of youth? Do you have any idea this is a multi-million-dollar meeting, or is your world just candy and fanciful dreams?" "Amara, that's enough." Mrs. Lewis hissed in desperation, trying to grab her daughter's arm. But Amara ignored it all. She didn't look at Richard, nor at her mother. Her gaze was fixed on the large screen, where the Japanese partners were watching the scene unfold with confused expressions. She took a deep breath, bowed formally, and then she spoke. Her words were a stream of flawless, fluent Japanese, with an astonishingly perfect accent, in Japanese. "Ladies and gentlemen, my sincerest apologies for the interruption. There was a slight misunderstanding in the previous translation. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The interpreter was speechless. Mrs. Lewis let her daughter's arm go, her eyes wide with a terrified awe. On the screen, the scowls on the Japanese partners' faces melted away, replaced by sheer astonishment. Amara turned back to Richard, switching to clear English. "Mr. Caldwell, your partner wasn't just talking about the importance of sales. He emphasized that the nuance of approaching the local market is the vital factor, not just a literal translation." Finished, she turned back to the screen and asked the partner directly in Japanese, "Has your intention been conveyed correctly now, sir?" The eldest partner on the screen burst out laughing. It was a hearty, booming laugh. He nodded eagerly, then looked straight at Richard and spoke in English. "Caldwell-san, this girl is correct. Entirely correct." He paused, a smile still playing on his lips. "In fact, she sounds more natural than your professional interpreter." The astonishment on Richard's face quickly hardened into a cold, unreadable mask. The partner's compliment, instead of soothing the situation, felt like a slap to his pride. To be shown up by a child in his own territory, in front of business partners, was an unacceptable humiliation. He couldn't let the story end here. He had to regain control. "This deal doesn't stop in Tokyo," Richard suddenly declared, his voice booming with authority, trying to pull the conversation back into his orbit. He turned to Amara, his gaze as sharp as if he were interrogating a rival, not a 14-year-old girl. And then he switched to French, the language of another key market they were targeting. "And what of the exclusive distribution clauses for the European market?" It was a sudden attack, a power play to prove this was his world, his rules. Amara didn't even blink. She replied instantly, in elegant and precise French. "The clauses are clear, sir, but they neglect to include digital streaming platforms, which could be a costly oversight." The answer wasn't just a translation, it was a strategic consultation. Richard felt as if the air had been punched from his lungs. This girl didn't just know the language, she understood the business. Richard's bewilderment now morphed into an irrational stubbornness. He would not lose. He would reach into the most obscure corner of his arsenal of knowledge for something he was certain no public library textbook could ever teach. He remembered a proverb he'd learned on a charity trip to Kenya years ago. He looked directly at Amara and uttered the deep, guttural sounds of Swahili. "Umoja ni nguvu, utengano ni udhaifu." Do you understand? Unity is strength, division is weakness. Do you understand? He said it with a cruel satisfaction, certain that this would be the final wall she could not possibly scale. But Amara only tilted her head, a faint, almost sympathetic smile touching her lips. And then she replied in the same language, her voice impossibly smooth and natural. "Ndio, nafahamu vizuri, Bwana Caldwell, na nuvu ya kweli haitokani na mahali ulipozaliwa, bali na kile unachochagua kujifunza." "Yes, I understand very well, Mr. Caldwell. And true strength doesn't come from where you were born, but from what you choose to learn." This time, it wasn't silence. An audible gasp of amazement came from one of the Japanese partners on the screen. The interpreter sank into his chair, his face pale. Mrs. Lewis brought a hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks, not of fear, but of an unbelievable pride. Richard Caldwell stood frozen. The entire fortress of prejudice he'd built his whole life, on race, on class, on human worth, was crumbling to its very foundations. He stared at the 14-year-old girl before him, and for the first time in his life, he was utterly speechless. The dead air in the conference room was finally broken, not by a voice in the room, but from the giant screen. The elderly Japanese partner, the one who had laughed so heartily before, now looked at Amara through the camera with genuine respect. "Young lady," he said in English, his voice low and warm, "that was extraordinary. Where did you learn all of this?" His question hung in the air, a sincere invitation, not an interrogation. Every eye in the room, including Richard's, turned to Amara, waiting for an answer to the impossible phenomenon before them. Amara glanced at her mother for a moment, as if seeking permission. Mrs. Lewis, still stunned, could only manage a numb nod. "My mother couldn't afford childcare for her night shifts," Amara began, her voice simple and direct, without a trace of self-pity. "So since I was little, I've always come with her, and the only place I could sit quietly for hours while waiting was the public library." She gazed into the distance, as if seeing those corridors of books right now. "I started with audiobooks because they were free. I listened to stories from all over the world. Then I found the old foreign language textbooks, the ones discarded in a corner. No one ever borrowed them." A hush fell over the room as everyone pictured it. A little girl dwarfed by towering shelves of old books, a pair of headphones on, a dog-eared book in her lap. "I realized that every language is like a key," Amara continued, her eyes lighting up. "It unlocks another world. It let me hear stories from Paris, Tokyo, or Nairobi, even while I was still sitting in the Bronx." She turned to look directly at Richard, and this time there was no defiance in her gaze, only a simple truth. "I didn't learn to impress anyone, sir. I learned so I could listen and connect to a world bigger than my neighborhood. That explanation, sincere and unadorned, landed with more force than her linguistic performance. It transformed Amara's extraordinary ability into something understandable, yet somehow that made it all the more admirable. Richard Caldwell said nothing. He looked from Amara to her mother, who was silently wiping away tears, and his own mocking words, a janitor's daughter. The Bronx Project suddenly echoed in his mind, bitter and raw. A hot flush of shame began to creep up his neck, mingled with an irresistible curiosity about the strange talent standing before him. The fortress of his prejudice had been breached, and he was beginning to waver. The online meeting ended in an unprecedented awkwardness. The Japanese partners offered polite farewells, but their lingering gazes on Amara said it all. An hour later, in the lavish silence of his penthouse office, Richard Caldwell still couldn't sit still. The initial shock and shame had cooled, giving way to a chaotic mix of emotions: annoyance at being outsmarted by a child, a grudging admiration, and above all, doubt. An impressive performance, yes, but improvising a few lines was a world away from withstanding the pressure of a real negotiation. The mind of a businessman told him that what he had just witnessed was impossible, and Richard Caldwell didn't believe in the impossible. He believed in tests. He picked up the phone. "Get Mrs. Lewis and her daughter up to my office, immediately." When Amara and her mother walked in, Mrs. Lewis kept her head down, wringing her hands, bracing for the worst. Amara, in contrast, stood tall, silent, and observant. Richard didn't invite them to sit. He rose, pacing around his massive desk like a predator. "An interesting performance," he began, his voice flat and emotionless. "But this conference room is not a stage." He stopped in front of them, his hands in his pockets. "Next Thursday, we have a multilateral online conference to finalize the contract for a new media project. Its value isn't a few million, but hundreds of millions of dollars. There will be partners from Paris, Tokyo, Nairobi, and Berlin. 4 languages will be used simultaneously at a dizzying pace." He looked directly at Amara, his eyes sharp. "My best interpreters are hesitant. They say it's an impossible task. Talent in an empty room is very different from metal under real pressure." A cold smirk touched Richard's lips. "I have a proposition for you." Mrs. Lewis's head snapped up, sensing danger. "Join that conference as the lead interpreter," Richard said, each word like a knife's edge. "Prove to me that what you did tonight wasn't just a fluke." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Here are the rules. If you fail a single mistake that offends a partner, a moment's hesitation that disrupts the flow, your mother is fired. On the spot. No explanation." Mrs. Lewis gasped, horror etched on her face. "No, sir, please don't. She's just a child." Richard ignored her, his eyes still locked on Amara. "But," he said, "if you succeed, if you can handle that chaos perfectly, I will consider giving you a chance. A real one." It was a cruel gamble, a power play disguised as an opportunity. He was placing their entire future on the shoulders of a 14-year-old girl. Mrs. Lewis shook her head frantically, her eyes welling with tears. "We can't. Amara, let's just go home." But Amara didn't move. She looked straight into Richard's eyes, seeing through the arrogance and the doubt to the flickering spark of curiosity within. She glanced at her mother, at her fear and her desperate love. She knew this wasn't a fair chance. It was a trap, but it was also the only way out. She took a deep breath, the weight of the world seemingly settling on her shoulders. "I'll do it," she said, her voice perfectly steady. "I accept the challenge." The door to Richard Caldwell's penthouse office slammed shut behind them, leaving the cold, lavish space behind. But the luxurious hallway leading to the elevator now felt like a walk to the gallows. "Are you out of your mind, Amara?" Mrs. Lewis whispered the moment they stepped into the elevator, her voice cracking with fear and anger. Do you have any idea what you just agreed to? We'll be on the street. He's just looking for an excuse to fire me." She turned to her daughter, gripping her shoulders and giving her a little shake, as if to wake her from a trance. "This isn't a game at the library, sweetheart. This is our life. He'll eat you alive. You're just a child." Amara remained silent until the elevator doors opened to the parking garage, where the air was damp and heavy with the smell of oil. She looked at her mother, her eyes clearer and more serious than ever before. "Mom," she said, her voice firm but full of emotion, "he looked down on us from the very first moment. Whether I do this or not, he will never see you as a person." She took a breath. "This isn't a choice between safety and danger. This is our only choice. If I don't do this, you could still be fired tomorrow for some ridiculous reason. But if I do this, if I succeed, they will never be able to look down on us again." Mrs. Lewis stared into her daughter's eyes. She saw not the innocence of a child, but a steely resolve, a weary wisdom forged in the long nights at the library and the long days watching her mother struggle. The fear inside her was still there, but it was beginning to make room for something else, a glimmer of faith in her own extraordinary child. She said nothing more. She simply pulled Amara into her arms and held her tight, a hug that contained all the fear, love, and silent prayers a mother could hold. On the day of the conference, Amara sat in a modern, soundproof interpretation booth, a space alien to the familiar corners of the library. Dressed in a simple white blouse, she looked small, swallowed by the state-of-the-art equipment. Beside her, two professional interpreters, a man and a woman about her mother's age, watched her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. The moment the conference began, the atmosphere in the booth grew taut. 4 screens displayed 4 feeds from Paris, Tokyo, Nairobi, and Berlin. The delegates spoke nearly at once, one language overlapping another, creating a chaotic torrent of sound. After only 10 minutes, the two professionals were already showing signs of being overwhelmed. The man repeatedly hit the delay button, asking the German delegate to slow down. The woman's brow was furrowed, her fingers flying across her keyboard, trying to keep up with the French delegate's idiomatic phrases. "Please repeat. The signal is unclear." Their words were a testament to their struggle, but Amara was different. She was perfectly still. Her eyes never left the screens, her headphones pressed tight against her ears. One hand held a pen, gliding across the page at a dizzying speed. But she wasn't writing words. She was drawing strange symbols, icons and lines that only she could understand, a shorthand system she had created herself from thousands of hours of listening to audiobooks. And then, when a rare pause occurred, she switched on her microphone. Her clear, calm voice filled the headphones of every delegate. "Monsieur Dubois from Paris," she began, "your point on exclusive licensing for digital content is a keen observation. However, Frau Schmidt from Berlin has just raised a concern regarding EU antitrust laws that might affect this clause. Meanwhile, Mr. Tanaka from Tokyo proposes a regional licensing model to solve the issue, and Mr. Onyango from Nairobi would like to know if that model would apply to emerging markets in Africa." She had done the impossible. She didn't just translate. She synthesized, analyzed, and connected 4 complex dialogues into a single, coherent summary, all in one go. She wasn't just an interpreter. She was a true conduit. In the control room, Richard Caldwell stood frozen, staring at the monitor. A silence fell over the conference. Then, the Japanese delegate, Mr. Tanaka, the man who had met Amara through the screen, switched on his microphone. He didn't talk about the contract. He talked about Amara. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in English for all to understand, "I have been in this industry for 30 years. I have worked with hundreds of interpreters." He paused, then looked directly into the camera, as if speaking directly to the girl in the booth. "But this is not translation, this is art." And then he stood up and clapped. Alone. After a stunned second, The French delegate rose. Then the Kenyan. Finally, the German. 4 people from 4 corners of the world, standing and applauding an unknown 14-year-old girl from the Bronx. When the conference ended to a chorus of praise for the genius interpreter, Richard didn't return to his penthouse office. He went straight to the interpretation booth. He opened the door. The 2 professional interpreters stood up, their faces a mixture of shame and utter admiration. Amara was taking off her headphones, her small shoulders slumped slightly with fatigue, but her eyes were still bright. Mrs. Lewis was already at the door, her face streaked with tears, ready to receive her daughter no matter the outcome. Richard stepped inside, and silence fell. He looked at Amara, not as a CEO looking at a child, but as a seasoned artist admiring a prodigy. "I was wrong," he said, a simple but heavy admission. "I was wrong to judge a person by the uniform they wear." He turned to Mrs. Lewis, who was holding her breath. "Mrs. Lewis, you are not fired." Richard paused, then continued, his voice clear and decisive. "Starting tomorrow, you will have a new position, Head of Building Personnel Services. I need someone with integrity and an eye for people in that role. Clearly, your daughter inherited that from you." Mrs. Lewis was speechless, her hands trembling as she brought them to her mouth. Richard turned back to Amara. "As for you," he said, "a talent like yours must not be wasted, and it certainly cannot be limited by circumstance. The Caldwell Corporation will establish a special scholarship, the Caldwell Global Scholarship, and you will be its first recipient." He looked the girl straight in the eye. "It will provide a full ride for you to study languages and international relations at any university in the world you choose. The corporation will invest in your talent, Amara Lewis." For a moment, Amara was speechless. She looked at her mother, who was weeping with unrestrained joy. She looked at the powerful man before her, the man who just days ago had treated her like dirt, and was now handing her a future. She didn't smile triumphantly. She simply stood tall and gave a solemn nod, the burden of the challenge now replaced by the weight of a life-changing opportunity. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice still clear and steady. "I won't let you down." The story of Amara Lewis could not be contained within the 4 walls of a conference room. It exploded. A few days later, financial news sites and social media feeds began to buzz with an incredible story. The headline was everywhere, from the front page of the Wall Street Journal to influential tech blogs. "One 4-year-old, from the Bronx stuns the global business world." The articles told of a multi-$100 million negotiation saved by a phenomenal linguistic talent, a janitor's daughter who had taught herself everything in a public library. An image of Amara simple in her white blouse, her eyes wise and calm, was juxtaposed with the glittering skyscrapers of New York. She immediately became a symbol, a living testament to the American dream, an inspiration to millions of kids growing up in difficult circumstances. For Richard Caldwell, this story was more than just a PR boost for the corporation. Every time he saw an article, every time he heard Amara Lewis's name on TV, he remembered the sound of his own contemptuous voice. "What do you know, kid?" That shame became a catalyst. He began to see his own building differently. He saw not just his top executives, but also the janitors, the security guards, the invisible people he'd never bothered to notice before. He wondered how many hidden talents were among them, how many other Amara Lewises were just waiting for a chance. His transformation didn't stop at his thoughts. A few months later, the Caldwell Corporation announced a groundbreaking new initiative, the Amara Lewis Global Language Program. It was a multi-million-dollar fund designed to identify and nurture linguistically gifted children from minority and low-income communities across the country. At the press conference, Richard Caldwell, a man known for his tough, pragmatic nature, spoke with a rare sincerity. "Talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. Our job is to build the bridge between them." Amara's story is more than just a modern-day fairy tale. It is a powerful affirmation. It proves that a person's worth is never defined by their origin, skin color, or social status. It lies in their talent, their relentless effort, and an iron will to rise. It shows that language is not merely a tool for communication. In the hands of a courageous young girl, it became a weapon to fight prejudice, the key to unlock a brighter future, and the bridge to connect worlds that seem destined to never meet. And in the end, the story teaches us that a person's true value is not determined by the color of their skin or the place of their birth, but by their ability and their will to never surrender to fate.